What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video from the 10/7 MMA show. First and foremost, Merry Christmas to everybody who is celebrating today. And apologize for my disheveled appearance and how I'm doing this video, but I'm currently visiting my family and but needed to make this video. And the reason why is because I saw the MMA guru actually drop a video earlier today talking about this potential to fight. And I think him and a lot of other folks are actually giving some credibility to this notion that the Ambani family, I think MMA Guru said a net worth of 90 billion. I believe it's actually closer to 120 billion, might be funding a fight between Conor and either Logan or Jake Paul, potentially. I think more likely, I guess people think more likely Logan than Jake, but I wanted to, and even I think Ariel Helwani and a lot of other folks are entertaining this notion. I wanted to give my 2 cents as to why I don't think there is a chance whatsoever that this will happen, at least not while Conor McGregor's under the UFC banner and while he's still under contract. Now, of course, people have made much about the fact that Conor's contract expires in, I believe, 2 more fights, assuming that doesn't get extended for whatever reason. So if Conor were to either get to the point where he can exercise his sunset clause, assuming it does exist, which I believe it does, or he fights out his contract without an extension and is able to do whatever he wants, right? In one of those cases, I could see him doing it. I do not believe that this fight is going to be any sort of a reality while he's under the UFC contract. I'm going to explain why. And by the way, this is actually much to the credit of the UFC, and I want to explain why in this video. So without further ado, let's get into my 3 reasons why I think this fight will not happen with either Jake or Logan. And while I think a fight against Jake Paul would be way more interesting, also too, to Jake Paul's credit, he's actually willing to get in the octagon and fight in mixed martial arts, which almost nobody's willing to do. So you got to give Jake Paul a lot of credit. He said he's willing to fight Nate Diaz. He's sure he's willing to fight Conor in mixed martial arts, but I think the Jake Paul fight is going to be a much more difficult one to achieve, if not impossible, and I'll go into why later in the video as well. But anyways, first and foremost, I think this is going to create a bad precedent for other fighters. If they do let Conor out of his contract one more time, I think it's going to create a lot of issues. And I'm talking about this from the perspective of retaining the value of the brand of the UFC. When Conor was let out, sort of, or they made an exception for him and allowed him to box Floyd Mayweather back in 2017. That was while he was still under the UFC contract. I believe that was the one and only time where something like this was allowed, where the UFC almost came in as a partner and Conor got this huge payday. So when that happened, everybody saw how much money Conor made and what a major deal it was, how much publicity he got, etc. And then, of course, other fighters wanted to do it. Now, the UFC could have kept doing that. And maybe in the short term, I believe they would have seen it as a moneymaker, right? I'm sure that Dana White and the UFC got paid quite handsomely for that fight. But the reason why I think they did not allow any other fighters to go forward. Now, we can say that they let Jorge Masvidal, who's still under contract, fight Nate Diaz in boxing, but they weren't a partner in that fight. And moreover, Jorge Masvidal is somebody who kind of went out on a bit of a losing streak, retired, and I think that was an exception because at the time he had officially retired from the UFC, so wasn't technically seen as a UFC fighter, was now retired, also kind of didn't have that same value to his name because he had kind of had a bit of a skid. So I don't think that damaged the UFC brand. But I think now if other fighters were to do this and go out and try and get a big payday and whatnot while under the UFC banner, while they're still considered an active fighter, and even if they're not a great fighter, but even if there's the perception that they're a good fighter, this can hurt the brand of the UFC and mixed martial arts in general. And I think that's why the UFC doesn't in general want someone, say, like Ian Gary or Sean O'Malley or one of these guys, to go out and have a boxing match while they're kind of on top in the UFC, because it can hurt the brand. Now, I say this is to the credit of the UFC because even though it could be a quick payday, I think they recognized long ago that in the long term, this could devalue mixed martial arts and the brand of the UFC as the premier fighting organization, not boxing, but fighting organization in the world. you start having fighters go in and lose in boxing, even though it's a completely different sport. For a lot of people who aren't as involved in mixed martial arts and combat sports in general, look at that as a boxer beating an MMA fighter, almost thinking, hey, boxing is supreme to mixed martial arts. Obviously, we know that's completely not true. And very low ranked MMA fighters in a all rules go fight would probably beat all of the best boxers in the world. It's just a given, especially if you take somebody with any reasonable level of grappling and wrestling, Muay Thai, kicks, elbows, knees, things that boxers are completely unaccustomed to. It's just too many weapons to deal with. But it could create that perception and that could hurt the sport. So again, even if the current executive board and folks in power right now maybe could grab a quick payday, they're not willing to do that. And I give them credit for that. So, anyways, this is one reason it's going to set a bad precedent. It's going to push all these other fighters to want to take these boxing matches, and boxing fights could cause some problems between fighters and the organization. Case in point, look at Francis Ngannou, somebody who wanted to go out and box. They wouldn't let him. He ended up leaving. That's, I'm sure, created some issues for the UFC. So I just don't think they're going to let this happen whatsoever for that reason, because they do have the long-term growth in mind for the brand and for the fighters as well. And as much as we want to beat up on the UFC, or some people do, for this stance, what I believe is that this is done with the fighters in mind in the long term. Because if they hadn't taken these stances and been so protective over the fighters over the years, the fighters today wouldn't be making as much as they are. The organization could have easily sputtered out, like the IFL, like Bellator / PFL is now seeming to sputter out, like all these other organizations that have paid more over the years. They haven't lasted. And I believe the reason why primarily is because the sport is still building and still growing. As big as people think it is, it still has a long way to grow, and there's still a lot of market share to be captured globally. So during this period of time, they have to invest heavily. Again, this is not me having dug into or done any specific research into the back end financials of the company and the organization, but that's what I feel is happening right now. Just as a fan and looking from the outside in, recognizing that there's still so much ground to cover. One of which would be just simply the implementation of more MMA gyms as learning grounds for kids growing up. I think that's one of the biggest reasons why soccer, basketball, and football are so ingrained in culture nationally or globally, because kids grow up playing these sports, so they want to watch the professionals compete at the highest level when they grow up. As that starts to happen more with mixed martial arts, I think that will, of course, build a stronger fan base for years to come. But anyways, they have the long-term growth in mind. This is not just for the organization, not just for the board members, but for the fighters as well. I believe there's good in this. I don't believe they're trying to just rip off the fighters like a lot of people think. And again, this is a partnership. They're all part of one team. And I do think, just like they want to support the staff of the UFC in terms of the employees, they also want to support the contractors, the fighters who obviously make the fights and are an essential component, the most essential component of the entire UFC. So, anyways, here's point number one. Now moving on to point number two. If Conor loses, it could irreparably harm the value of the UFC. So you might go back to the Floyd Mayweather thing and say, well, they made an exception there. He could come in and do the same type of thing. It would be a boxing fight, no big deal. Now, boxing match, excuse me, no big deal. The problem with this compared to then, and also too, even if it was somebody else, even if it was like Canelo Alvarez, I actually don't think they would do it. But especially why I don't think they would do it against Logan Paul or even Jake Paul is because when he fought Floyd Mayweather, I made this point in another video, he was obviously expected to lose. And that was no shame. Floyd Mayweather was the greatest boxer of all time. I think there was a lot of misleading hype in the lead up to that fight, getting a lot of the public, me included. I fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, that Conor had a shot. Uh, there was a lot of that build up and narrative. Even Brendan Schaub said he was essentially paid by Showtime to reinforce this nonsensical. If you ever see that movie, The Great White Hype, where they had everybody think that this random boxer could come in and beat the champ. The champ was totally out of shape, didn't train. He still smoked the white dude. It was literally the storyline of that movie. Go back and watch The Great White Hype. It was crazy. But anyways, in that fight, nobody really thought Conor could win, except for people like me who were idiots who fell for the sham, for the scam, because honestly we wanted to believe it. It is what it is. Sometimes you want it so badly you fall for it. But In that case, it was not a big surprise, and Conor actually did relatively well considering the odds that he was up against. This is a totally different scenario. Now he's fighting somebody who is quote known as a YouTuber and has had a few fights, is a tremendous athlete, but he's not a fighter. And the problem is, if you look at what happened between Logan and Floyd, Floyd wasn't really able to knock him out. And because Logan has such a size and weight advantage, he's got the grappling background. He was a state champ wrestler in one of the most competitive wrestling states, Ohio, in the country. This is a very dangerous fight, meaning it's not even if Conor loses, but if Conor even has a mediocre performance, he's gonna look foolish, and which is gonna make the UFC look foolish. Now, if he's out of the UFC and he's retired and maybe taking a couple losses and people don't look at Conor the same way, that's different. But the problem is public perception, regardless of how good Conor still is, public perception. I'm talking outside of fans of the real fans of the UFC, but I'm saying just generally people still look at Conor, and probably a lot of people think that Conor is still on top of his game and the greatest UFC fighter ever, right? Just because he's the most prominent name. So you have somebody like him go out, take a boxing match while under the UFC banner with 2 fights, active fighter, ranked in the lightweight division, goes out and loses to Logan Paul, who barely fights, who had a terrible fight against Dylan Dennis. It's going to hurt the brand of the UFC. And again, I say that they're not going to let him do it to the credit of the UFC, because if the Ambani family, net worth of 120 billion, is willing to pay the UFC a really large amount of money, I'm sure that would be cut as bonus checks for all these executives and employees and whatnot. And they could get a quick payday, but they're not going to do it, I don't believe, because they want to protect the brand value of the UFC for shareholders, right? For people who have invested in the company and people who believe in the company. And I think the UFC knows that this sport can take over the planet, and it's continuing to grow and grow at an exponential rate. So they're not going to let then it's not going to happen. They're not going to let them do that and make this fight while under contract when it could be so harmful. And even if he goes out and wins, now you know you have the other chance that Conor could go out there and starts Logan Paul and win. But how does that even add anything positive? I'm saying for the brand of the UFC, if he goes out and knocks out a guy, it's like he should have knocked him out, right? So like, there's really no massive upside to Conor taking on a fight like this. So I don't think it's going to happen. Even if it was some sort of charity event, I don't think they would let him do it. Not against Logan Paul. All right. Now we come to the last point, and this is going to be specifically about Jake Paul. So the much more interesting fight is not Logan, it's Jake, primarily because of all the crazy stuff Jake has said over the years. The fact that he's been kind of vying for this match for a long time, and people thought it was ludicrous at one point, and now it seems like Conor finally actually wants it. I mean, the fact that that's even happened is insane. But and also Jake Paul's a I mean, I think Jake Paul would win for sure in a boxing match, given all the time and effort Jake has put into pure boxing, what he's done. I mean, knocking out Tyron Woodley, knocking out defeating Anderson Silva. Jake's gonna win this fight. I mean, that's all that needs to be said. They're not gonna let that happen for that in and of itself. But you add on top of that the negative relationship that Jake Paul has between the UFC, which is not just, even if you want to say it could be potentially manufactured, he said real things that are actually potentially damaging to the UFC brand, basically claiming that the UFC is underpaying their fighters, and talking really negatively about Dana White, and really maligning almost the character of the UFC staff, or the executive branch of the UFC staff in terms of their business operations. There's just no way they would ever go into business, I think, with somebody like that. And he's probably would, I imagine, continue to talk negatively about the UFC unless they work out some arrangement or agreement where that would stop him from doing that. But I don't think Jake Paul would stop. I remember at one point Brendan Schaub said on his podcast, "Hey Jake, listen, I get what you're doing. You're making waves. The one thing you got to do, I think, to make something happen with Conor or keep moving forward, you got to stop talking about the UFC and its pay structure and all this stuff. Are you willing to do that?" And Jake said, "Absolutely not. This is not a shtick." But this is what Brendan Schaub said. Apparently, it's not a shtick. I'm not just doing it to get attention. I really believe in this. I really think they should have a fighter union, et cetera, et cetera. So apparently Jake Paul is sticking to his guns. I think he would continue to stick to his guns if they did schedule a fight. And I think it could be disastrous for the UFC potentially. So there's no way I think they would do anything with Jake Paul. Now, whether or not, now, even though they have a positive relationship, it seems, with Logan Paul, his beverage prime, and Dana White seems to have a positive relationship with Logan. for the aforementioned reasons, I don't think that's going to happen as well. So I'm curious to see if people still keep saying, yes, this could happen because we got a billionaire family involved, not just a billionaire, a multi billionaire family involved in the payday and blah, blah, blah. You know, do people really think just because of the money that they're willing to do it? I mean, we could say the same thing about Francis Ngannou doing a co-promotion with PFL Bellator with Turkey Al Sheikh involved because it would be a massive payday for the UFC. But again, most people quickly acknowledge that that would never happen because we know that the UFC has so much to lose with the co-promotion with the PFL. If the PFL fighter, namely Francis Ngannou, would beat John Jones, I think it's the same thing here, exact same thing. You have Logan Paul beat Conor McGregor. I think that's disastrous for the brand. Whether or not it actually means anything, which I don't think it would, but to most people who are not even casual fans, but even like beyond casual fans, just very like, oh, I heard a big, like all the people that went out to watch the Jake Paul Mike Tyson fight, like those type of people that would gravitate towards it. It would create this notion that's, that would just totally hurt the brand of the UFC. So, anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Uh, I feel very, very confident in this stance, but let me know if you agree or disagree. Curious to see how the narrative unfolds as the next few days kind of continue on, and maybe people continue to talk about this more and more. I don't think this has any real juice behind it. The only reason why I think Conor brought this up, and while all these tweets were made, and while he was even having potential meetings with the Mbani family and others, is just to encourage the UFC to schedule a fight for him sooner than the third or fourth quarter of 2025. I think he wants to fight. I think he needs to fight immediately. And this is just like when he was trying to arrange a charity bout between him and Dustin Poirier back in whatever it was, 2021 or 2022, and then that kind of put the fire to the feet of the UFC, which eventually scheduled the first rematch with Dustin. I think he's doing the same thing here. I think whether he wants to fight Michael Chandler or somebody else, maybe Nate Diaz, who knows? I think he's trying to push the UFC's hand to schedule something. Let's see if it works. That I'd love to see. I'd love to see Conor get back into the octagon, and he might be dealing with a lot of negative stuff right now. As I mentioned, I think he's probably in serious financial trouble because of all the backlash from his civil suit. And whatever you want to say about the veracity of the things that Nikita Hand has said or whatnot, I'm sure Conor is under a lot of pressure and stress right now. For Look, I'm sure he's in a tough spot. I'm not commenting on the details of the case because I haven't really dove in yet enough to give a concrete opinion one way or the other. I guess all I'm trying to say is you hate for something like super negative to be the driving force for this to actually finally happen, but this could be a net positive for Conor, maybe to finally get him back in there, get him training, get him focused, get him working again, get him off whatever things negative that he was doing in his life. So, as people say, if a bad, horrible thing happens to you, but it leads to something good, was it bad in the first place? I think Michael Chandler's been saying that lately, but I believe he's gotten that from somewhere. But you know, I think we can all relate to that statement. So, anyways, I would like to see Conor get back into the octagon, get back into real training, see what he really can do, especially after that horrific leg injury. That in and of itself, to be able to come back and to have a fight would be a triumph in and of itself. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thank you guys so much for joining. Click that like button if you did like this video. Make sure to click subscribe if you want to see more from the 10-7 MMA show. Thank you guys so much. Merry Christmas. We'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.